Vibrations rattled the crystal chandelier overhead as the ballroom fell dead silent. Moments earlier, Clary's ex-fiancé Bradley had shoved her laughing as he sneered to the crowd of Manhattan elites. Look at her, she's a nobody, a pathetic stray, crashing a world she doesn't belong in. Cruel laughter died in their throats, however, as the heavy oak doors swung open. Gabriel Rossi, the ruthless billionaire, everyone in this room was desperate to impress, strode past the city's elite. Ignoring their outstretched hands, he walked straight to where Clary stood trembling and bowed perfectly at the waist. "My boss," he whispered. The rain in New York City always felt different when a heart was breaking. It wasn't the romantic, cinematic drizzle that washed the streets clean. It was a cold, unforgiving downpour that soaked through a coat and chilled straight to the bone. Clary stood outside Le Bernardin, shivering in a faux silk dress she had bought on clearance 3 years ago, watching the man she had given her 20s to wrap his tailored cashmere coat around another woman's shoulders. Her name was Victoria DuPont. She had the kind of generational wealth that made people speak in hushed tones, hair that always looked perfectly blown out, and a pedigree that Bradley Kensington, Clary's boyfriend of 5 years, craved more than oxygen. Bradley and Clary had met in a cramped coffee shop near Columbia Law School. She was working 3 jobs to pay off her mother's medical debts, and he was a stressed, sleep-deprived law student. She had typed his papers, paid his half of the rent, and skipped meals so he could afford the networking dinners that were crucial for his career. She had built the foundation upon which he was now standing tall. Today, the day he made junior partner at Crane and Sullivan, was supposed to be their celebration. Instead, it was her execution. "Clary, you have to be reasonable," Bradley had said just 10 minutes earlier, sitting across from her at the white-clothed table. He hadn't even looked her in the eye. He was too busy swirling his $300 Pinot Noir. "You and we've run our course. I'm entering a different stratosphere now. I need a partner who understands this world, someone who commands respect. Victoria is, well, she's a DuPont." Clary had stared at him, the sting of betrayal so sharp it knocked the wind out of her. "A different stratosphere, Bradley. I paid for the suit you're wearing to impress her. I kept the lights on when you were studying for the bar. And I'm grateful, Clary. I really am," he replied, his tone dripping with a condescension that made her stomach churn. "I'll write you a check for what I owe you, but let's be honest. Look at you. You're an archivist at a public library. You shrink in social settings. In the circles I'm moving into, you're a nobody. You'd drown." Victoria had emerged from the powder room, then gliding to their table like a swan. She didn't even look at Clary as she slipped her hand into Bradley's. "Darling, is the charity case still here? The valet is bringing the Bentley around." Clary didn't scream. She didn't throw her water in his face, though every fiber of her being wanted to. She simply stood up, placed the promise ring he had given her 3 years ago, a cheap tarnished silver band, into his half-empty wine glass. The tiny splash was the only sound she made before walking out into the torrential rain. Standing on the curb, watching the sleek black Bentley pull away, she felt a hollow emptiness echoing inside her chest. Bradley thought he knew her. He thought she was just Clary Hayes, the quiet, mousy girl who liked old books and faded into the background. He thought she came from nothing. He was wrong. Her mother had changed their last name when Clary was 5 years old. They fled Chicago in the dead of night, leaving behind a life of unimaginable wealth and terrifying violence. Her mother had wanted a quiet, normal life for her, free from the blood-soaked legacy of her father's family. For 20 years, Clary had honored her dying wish to remain hidden, to stay small, to play the nobody. But as the freezing rain plastered her hair to her face, a dark, dormant part of her DNA began to wake up. Bradley's mockery rang in her ears. A nobody. Clary pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen was cracked, the battery dying. She opened a hidden contact file, one she hadn't looked at since her mother's funeral 3 years ago. There was only a single unlisted international number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. If she made this call, the quiet life Clary Hayes knew would die tonight. The shadows her mother had run from would swallow her whole. But as another town car splashed a puddle of dirty street water against her boots, the last ounce of her patience evaporated. She pressed dial. It rang exactly once. Direzione, a deep, gravelly voice answered in flawless Italian. It's Clary, she said, her voice eerily calm despite the trembling of her hands. She switched to the dialect her mother had secretly taught her in their locked apartment. Clary De Luca. Tell my uncle. I'm ready to come home. Less than 48 hours later, the illusion of Clary the librarian was entirely dismantled. She sat in the penthouse suite of the Baccarat Hotel, surrounded by 4 men in impeccably tailored dark charcoal suits. They stood like statues, their eyes scanning the room, hands resting subtly near their waistbands. The air smelled of espresso expensive leather and the heavy metallic tang of impending power. Across from her sat Gabriel Rossi. If Bradley Kensington was a man playing at power, Gabriel Rossi was the concept of power made flesh. At 32, he was the acting underboss of the De Luca Syndicate, a multi-billion-dollar empire that controlled shipping routes, real estate development from Manhattan to Palermo, and a highly sophisticated, completely untraceable underworld network. Gabriel was brutally handsome with sharp aristocratic features, piercing olive green eyes, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from marble. But it was his aura that suffocated the room. He didn't demand attention. His mere presence extracted it. You're kinky. Your Uncle Don Carmine suffered a fatal heart attack 3 days ago. Gabriel said, his voice a low melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate the crystal tumblers on the table. He had no sons. Your mother was his only sister. According to the old laws and the airtight corporate trusts that control our legitimate billions, the majority shares do not pass to the capos. They pass to the bloodline. He slid a thick leather-bound folio across the glass table. You are the sole heir to the De Luca enterprise, Clary. $7 billion in liquid assets, 51% voting rights in the holding company, and absolute authority over the 5 families of the East Coast. Clary stared at the documents. The sheer magnitude of the numbers printed on the pages made her head spin. For 5 years, she had balanced a checkbook down to the penny to make sure Bradley had clean shirts for his mock trials. Now she was looking at wealth that could buy the very law firm Bradley worshipped fire him and turn the building into a parking lot before lunch. Why me? She asked, looking up to meet Gabriel's intense gaze. You've been running things. You know the business. I know the Dewey Decimal System. Gabriel's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of her dry humor. Because the commission requires a De Luca on the throne. The older captains, men like Russo and Moretti, are traditionalists. They are currently circling like sharks, waiting for a moment of weakness to tear the syndicate apart. They will not accept an outsider like me as the head of the table, but they cannot defy the bloodline. I need you on that throne, Clary, and in return, I will be your sword. I will teach you, protect you, and ensure nobody ever looks down on you again. He leaned forward, the scent of bergamot and cedarwood washing over her. I investigated your life, Clary. I know about the unpaid bills. I know about the sick mother. I know about Bradley Kensington. Her breath hitched at the sound of his name. A pathetic, climbing parasite. Gabriel said softly, his eyes darkening with a dangerous, lethal storm. He discarded the rightful queen of the East Coast for a minor heiress with a fraction of your wealth. Give me the word, Clary and Bradley Kensington will never practice law or walk again. The offer was intoxicating. The sheer terrifying ease with which Gabriel could destroy the man who had broken her was a heavy temptation. But she remembered the cold rain, the pity in Victoria's eyes, the utter disdain in Bradley's voice. A sudden violent accident would be too merciful. She didn't just want him broken physically. She wanted his ego, his world, and his arrogance shattered into dust. No, Clary said, her voice hardening. She sat up straighter, feeling the invisible weight of her ancestors settling onto her shoulders. Bradley values status. He worships the elite. I don't want you to lay a finger on him, Gabriel. I want to take everything he respects, everything he aspires to be, and I want to rule it. Gabriel's green eyes flared with a sudden intense heat. A genuine dangerous smile finally broke across his face, transforming him from a cold, statuesque enforcer into a fiercely loyal predator. As you wish," Gabriel murmured, standing up. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy antique gold ring bearing the crest of the DeLuca family, a roaring lion holding a severed snake. He stepped toward her gently, taking her right hand and slid the heavy gold onto her index finger. The metal was cold, but it felt like it belonged there. "Tonight is the Diamond Charity Gala at the Plaza Hotel," Gabriel announced, turning to his men. "The entire upper echelon of New York's corporate and social elite will be there. The sharks from our world will also be watching. It is time the city meets its new owner." He looked back at her, his gaze softening just a fraction. "Let's get you dressed, Capo." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a glittering sea of diamonds, tuxedos, and generational arrogance. This was the pinnacle of New York high society, a room where billion-dollar mergers were whispered over champagne and careers were made or destroyed with a single introduction. Bradley Kensington was in his element. From across the room, Clary watched him. She stood in the shadowed archway of the mezzanine overlooking the extravagant floor. She was unrecognizable from the girl in the rain 2 nights ago. Gabriel had brought in a team of Parisian stylists who had worked a miracle. She was sheathed in a custom blood-red Versace gown that clung to her curves like liquid fire, featuring a daring slit and a plunging neckline that radiated unapologetic power. Around her neck rested the DeLuca diamond, a flawless, 50-carat heirloom that had once belonged to European royalty. Her hair, usually tied in a messy bun, cascaded in sleek dark waves down her back. Bradley was currently hovering near the center of the room, clutching Victoria's arm. They were desperately trying to inch closer to the VIP section. The talk of the town, the rumor that had been flying through the Wall Street and legal circuits all week, was that Gabriel Rossi's secretive syndicate was looking for new legal representation. Landing the Rossi account would guarantee Bradley a senior partnership and an 8-figure bonus. He looked like a starving dog begging for a scrap from a master's table. He's been trying to bribe the maitre d' for 20 minutes just to get a seat near our table, Gabriel murmured. He materialized beside her, dressed in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that made him look like a dark god among mortal men. His presence alone made the temperature in her vicinity drop. "Let him come closer," Clary said, her voice cool. She slowly descended the sweeping marble staircase. Heads began to turn. Conversations faltered. It wasn't just the dress or the diamonds. It was the way she walked. Gabriel had spent hours coaching her, teaching her how to hold her chin, how to let her eyes glaze over with the detached boredom of the ultra-rich. She wasn't scurrying to get out of people's way anymore. She moved like the room was built for her. She glided across the floor, heading straight for the opulent bar near where Bradley and Victoria were stationed. As she approached, Bradley was mid-sentence, aggressively pitching himself to a bored-looking hedge fund manager. "And our firm can guarantee absolute discretion, which is why when Mr. Rossi finally arrives, I intend to—" Bradley stopped. He had turned to grab a fresh drink from a passing waiter, and his eyes locked onto hers. For 3 agonizing seconds, his brain short-circuited. He recognized the face of the woman he had belittled, the librarian he had called a nobody, but his mind couldn't reconcile that face with the regal, terrifyingly beautiful woman wearing a fortune in diamonds. Victoria noticed his paralysis and followed his gaze. Her perfectly contoured face pinched in confusion, then immediate visceral jealousy. "Clary?" Bradley breathed out, his voice cracking. He blinked, shaking his head. What are you doing here?" She picked up a crystal flute of champagne from the bar, taking a slow, deliberate sip before acknowledging him. "Hello, Bradley. Enjoying the party." The shock on his face rapidly curdled into defensive anger. His ego, fragile and easily bruised, took over. He stepped closer, his face flushing red, looking around frantically to see if anyone had noticed him talking to his discarded trash. "How did you get in here?" he hissed, keeping his voice low but venomous. "Did you follow me? Are you insane, Clary?" This is a $20,000 a plate dinner. You belong in a soup kitchen, not the plaza. If you rented that dress to try and make me jealous, it's pathetic." Victoria stepped up beside him, crossing her arms. "Bradley, is this the stalker ex-security really needs to do better? She probably snuck in through the kitchen." "I'm calling the guards," Bradley sneered, pulling out his phone. He wanted to make a scene. He wanted to assert his dominance in front of his new peers. He raised his hand, snapping his fingers at a nearby security guard. "Excuse me, this woman is trespassing. She's a nobody and she's harassing us. Throw her out." Several guests nearby turned to watch the commotion. Bradley puffed out his chest, looking victorious, waiting for the guards to drag her away in humiliation. "I'd advise against that," Clary said smoothly, her voice carrying perfectly over the ambient string quartet. Before the security guard could even take a step toward her, a heavy, deafening silence rippled through the grand ballroom. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The massive mahogany doors at the entrance had opened, and Gabriel Rossi had stepped fully into the light. He didn't walk alone. 6 massive men in identical dark suits flanked him, moving with the synchronized, terrifying precision of apex predators. The crowd practically threw themselves out of the way, parting like the Red Sea. Whispers of, "It's Rossi," and "That's him," buzzed through the elite crowd like electricity. Bradley's eyes widened to the size of saucers. He immediately dropped his phone back into his pocket, his posture straightening so fast Clary thought he might snap his spine. He shoved past Victoria, practically drooling as he stepped forward, thrusting his hand out toward the approaching billionaire. "Mr. Rossi!" Bradley called out, his voice practically trembling with desperation. "Bradley, Kensington, Crane, and Sullivan. It is an absolute honor, sir. If you have a moment, Gabriel didn't even look at him. He didn't break his stride. As Bradley stood there with his hand out, Gabriel's lead bodyguard casually shoved Bradley in the chest, sending the junior partner stumbling backward into a cocktail table, knocking over a tower of champagne glasses with a loud, humiliating crash. Bradley fell to his knees, his expensive suit soaked in sticky alcohol, his face burning bright crimson as the entire room gasped. Victoria shrieked, backing away. But Gabriel Rossi wasn't looking at the shattered glass. His eyes were fixed solely on Clary. He stopped exactly 3 feet away. The billionaire, the ruthless underground kingpin that every CEO and politician in this room feared, unbuttoned his suit jacket. He took her hand, the same hand Bradley had forced a cheap ring onto the same hand that had served Bradley for 5 years, and brought her knuckles to his lips. Then, in front of 500 of the most powerful people in New York, Gabriel Rossi stepped back and bowed perfectly deeply at the waist. "My boss." Gabriel's voice echoed in the dead silent room, loud enough for every single person to hear. "The car is ready whenever you wish to leave." Clary looked down at Bradley. He was still on his knees in the puddle of champagne, staring up at her. The smug, arrogant lawyer was gone. In his place was a pale, trembling man who had just realized he hadn't dumped a nobody. He had dumped the Queen of New York, and she was going to ruin him. The morning after the Diamond Charity Gala, the sky over Manhattan was the color of bruised iron. Inside the gleaming glass and steel monolith of Crane and Sullivan, located in Hudson Yards, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Bradley Kensington had barely slept. He had spent the entire night pacing his luxury apartment, ignoring frantic calls from Victoria and chugging black coffee while staring at the wall. The image of Gabriel Rossi, the undisputed, terrifying king of New York's underworld and legitimate shipping ports bowing to Clary, played on a loop in his mind. My boss. The words echoed like a death knell for his career. Bradley had spent years cultivating the perfect image, distancing himself from the charity case he deemed beneath him. Now that same woman held the keys to the kingdom he was desperately trying to claw his way into. At 9 a.m., sharp, Bradley's desk phone rang. It was the icy voice of Richard Sullivan, the firm's senior founding partner. "Kensington, conference room A, now." Bradley straightened his Tom Ford tie, his hands shaking slightly. He convinced himself he could fix this. He was a master manipulator, a silver-tongued litigator. Clary was still the girl who used to bake him cookies when he stressed over exams. She was soft. He could apologize, spin a narrative of a tragic misunderstanding, and use their history to secure the Rossi account for the firm. If he did that, Sullivan would make him a full partner by noon. He pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of Conference Room A, plastering on his most charming, apologetic smile. The smile died instantly. Sitting at the head of the massive oak table wasn't Richard Sullivan. It was Clary. She was dressed in a razor-sharp ivory-white Alexander McQueen pantsuit that screamed immaculate wealth and untouchable authority. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, and her fingers, adorned only with the heavy gold DeLuca crest ring, were steepled in front of her. Gabriel Rossi stood behind her right shoulder, a silent, looming specter of violence in a charcoal Brioni suit. Richard Sullivan, a man who usually commanded a room with terrifying volume, was sweating profusely, standing off to the side like a reprimanded schoolboy. "Ah, Bradley," Clary said. Her voice was no longer the soft, accommodating whisper he was used to. It was cold, polished glass. "Take a seat." Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Sullivan to Gabriel, whose green eyes stared right through him, promising agonizing pain if he made a single wrong move. Bradley slowly sank into a chair opposite Clary. "Clary, look about last night." Bradley started leaning forward, trying to inject warmth into his voice. "I was shocked. I didn't mean those things. You have to know I was just caught off guard. We have 5 years of history. Mr. Kensington." Gabriel's voice cracked through the room like a whip, freezing Bradley's blood. "You will address her as Ms. DeLuca, or you will not speak at all." Bradley choked on his words, shrinking back into the leather chair. Ms. DeLuca." Clary didn't blink. She reached out and flipped open a thick, leather-bound portfolio on the table. "I didn't come here to reminisce about a past you threw away for a DuPont, Bradley. I came here for business. Mr. Sullivan and I have spent the last hour discussing the future of this firm." Sullivan stepped forward, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Bradley, as of this morning, DeLuca Enterprises has acquired a 70% controlling interest in the Shell Corporation that owns the lease to this building, as well as absorbing our largest corporate debt portfolios. Ms. DeLuca is effectively the owner of Crane and Sullivan." Bradley's jaw unhinged. The world spun. Clary hadn't just gotten rich. She had bought the chessboard he was playing on. "I reviewed the roster of junior partners this morning." Clary continued, her eyes fixed on Bradley like a sniper analyzing a target. "I noticed a glaring inefficiency. A lawyer who built his career on the financial and emotional labor of others. A man whose judgment is so fundamentally flawed that he insults a billionaire in public and begs like a dog a moment later." "Clary, please." Bradley whispered, the reality of his total destruction finally settling in. He wasn't talking to his ex-girlfriend. He was talking to an apex predator. "You're terminated, Bradley," Clary said softly. "But I'm not just firing you. Gabriel." Gabriel stepped forward and tossed a heavy manila folder onto the table. It slid to a halt right in front of Bradley. Inside, Gabriel rumbled, "Are detailed logs of your billable hours over the last 3 years, specifically the hours you falsified, the clients you overcharged while you were out networking at the Montecito Club. It is enough evidence to have you disbarred in the state of New York and likely face federal wire fraud charges." Bradley's face drained of all color. He was hyperventilating, his hands trembling as he stared at the folder. You can't do this. I'll be ruined. I'll go to prison." "You wanted to fly in a different stratosphere, Bradley," Clary said, leaning back in her chair. "Welcome to the altitude. The air's very thin up here. You have 10 minutes to clear out your desk. If you ever contact me or approach me again, I will not just ruin your career. I will erase your existence." She stood up, buttoning her jacket. Gabriel immediately stepped to her side, offering his arm. "Oh, and Bradley." Clary paused at the door, looking over her shoulder. "Leave the Rolex. You bought it with my mother's life insurance money. It belongs to me." Bradley, weeping silently, unclasped the watch and left it on the table. He was utterly broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant man he was yesterday. As Clary and Gabriel stepped into the private elevator, the doors sliding shut. Clary finally exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for years. Her legs shook slightly, the adrenaline crashing through her system. Gabriel looked down at her, his expression softening just a fraction. "You handled that like a true Don Clary, brutal, surgical, and without a drop of blood." "It felt terrifying," she admitted, looking up into his intense green eyes. "Power always is the first time," Gabriel murmured, reaching out to gently tuck a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His touch was shockingly warm, sending a jolt of electricity down her spine. "But you are built for this. Now the real war begins. The boardroom was child's play. Tonight you meet the wolves." The meeting was held beneath the bustling streets of Little Italy, hidden behind the unassuming facade of a wholesale meat importer. The basement had been converted into a lavish, soundproofed bunker decades ago by Clary's grandfather. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, espresso, and tension so dense you could cut it with a switchblade. Seated around the massive circular mahogany table were the heads of the 5 families. These were men who controlled billions in illegal gambling, port smuggling, and extortion across the eastern seaboard. They were old, dangerous men with scars on their faces and blood on their ledgers. At the head of the table sat Clary. Gabriel stood directly behind her chair, a visual reminder that whoever came for the queen had to go through her executioner first. Directly across from Clary sat Domenico Russo. Russo was a grizzled man in his late 60s, with a face like a crushed velvet pillow and eyes as cold as a morgue. He commanded the largest faction of soldiers and had fully expected to take over the De Luca syndicate after her uncle's death. "So," Russo rasped, leaning forward and tapping a massive gold ring against the table. "Carmine's little secret, the librarian. We are supposed to kiss the ring of a girl who spent the last 5 years stamping books and dating a yuppie lawyer. It is an insult to La Cosa Nostra." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the other 3 dons. Gabriel's hand twitched toward his jacket, but Clary raised a single manicured finger, silently commanding him to hold steady. Don Russo. Clary said, her voice smooth and devoid of fear. She had spent the last 4 hours memorizing the dossiers Gabriel had provided. "You speak of tradition, of respect for La Cosa Nostra. Yet my uncle's body was barely cold before you began moving product through the Brooklyn docks without paying the syndicate's tariff." Russo's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about, little girl. Don't insult my intelligence, Domenico." Clary snapped, her voice suddenly cracking like thunder echoing off the stone walls. The older men at the table flinched. 2 nights ago, a shipment of untaxed automatic weapons came through Pier 42. You bypassed the De Luca inspectors, and worse, you took funding for this rogue operation from an outside source. Clary slid a series of glossy photographs and bank statements across the table. The other dons leaned in, their expressions darkening as they read the documents. "A wire transfer of $4 million, Clary continued, her eyes locked onto Russo. "From a holding company owned by Arthur DuPont, Victoria DuPont's father." Russo's face paled beneath his leathery tan. To take outside money, especially from arrogant old money elites like the DuPonts, to subvert the ruling family was high treason in their world. "The DuPonts were angry that I humiliated their future son-in-law, Bradley Kensington," Clary explained to the rest of the table. "They wanted to strike at me, and they found a willing, greedy dog in Don Russo. He sold our syndicate's honor to a Wall Street banker just to undermine my seat at this table." Lies," Russo roared, standing up violently, his chair crashing to the floor. 2 of his bodyguards reached for their weapons. Before they could even clear their holsters, Gabriel moved. He was a blur of lethal precision. In less than 2 seconds, Gabriel had vaulted the table, drawn a suppressed matte black pistol, and shot both of Russo's bodyguards in the kneecaps. The loud thwack-thwack of the suppressed weapon echoed, followed immediately by the screams of the 2 men collapsing to the floor. Gabriel grabbed Russo by the throat, slamming the older Don face first into the mahogany table. He pressed the hot barrel of the pistol directly against Russo's temple. The entire room froze. The other Dons held their breath, their own guards paralyzed by the sheer speed and violence of Gabriel's reaction. "You raise your voice at the boss again," Gabriel whispered into Russo's ear, his voice a demonic hiss, "and I will paint this room with your brains." Clary stood up slowly. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face was an impenetrable mask of ice. She walked around the table, her heels clicking methodically on the stone floor, until she stood over the terrified, pinned Don Russo. "I am Clary DeLuca," she said softly, staring down at him. "The blood of Carmine and Vincenzo runs in my veins. I do not care if you respect my past, but you will respect my throne, or I will let Gabriel put you in the ground tonight. Do we have an understanding?" Russo, choking under Gabriel's iron grip, managed a pathetic, gurgling nod. Clary looked at the other Dons. "The DuPont family thought they could play Mafia. They thought they could buy one of our own. Starting tomorrow, we freeze every offshore account the DuPonts have tied to our illegal books. We bleed them dry. The DeLuca syndicate is united under her. Anyone who disagrees can join Domenico on the floor." No one spoke. One by one, the Dons stood, walked over to Clary, and bowed their heads. "La vendetta è tua, boss," they murmured. When the room finally cleared, leaving only Clary, Gabriel, and a crew to clean up the bleeding guards, Clary's adrenaline finally broke. She swayed slightly, grabbing the edge of the table. Gabriel was there in an instant. He dropped his weapon on the table and wrapped his strong, muscular arms around her waist, catching her before she could fall. He pulled her flush against his chest. He smelled of gunpowder and danger, but to Clary, it was the safest scent in the world. "I've got you," Gabriel murmured, his lips brushing against her hair. "I've got you, Clary. You were magnificent." Clary looked up at him, her chest heaving. The sheer proximity to him, the raw power and loyalty he radiated, ignited something primal inside her. The mousy librarian was dead. She was the queen now, and this lethal, beautiful man was her king. Without thinking, she reached up her hands, tangling in the lapels of his suit, and pulled him down. Their lips crashed together in a fiery, desperate kiss. Gabriel groaned a deep, guttural sound, his arms tightening around her back, lifting her slightly off the floor. It was a kiss forged in violence and absolute loyalty, burning away the last remnants of Clary's old life. When they finally broke apart, breathing heavily, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "The DuPonts won't take this quietly," he whispered, his eyes blazing with a mixture of lust and protective fury. "They are cornered animals now." "Let them come," Clary replied, her voice steady, her eyes dark. "We'll crush them all." 3 weeks later, the war had gone from shadows to headlines. The financial pages of the Wall Street Journal and Forbes were baffled by the sudden catastrophic collapse of the DuPont corporate empire. Supply chains mysteriously vanished. Cargo ships carrying DuPont assets were tied up in indefinite customs holds at ports controlled by DeLuca unions. Whistleblowers suddenly emerged, dropping massive dossiers of tax evasion and embezzlement onto the desks of federal prosecutors. Arthur DuPont was facing prison, and Victoria's trust fund had been frozen indefinitely. Bradley Kensington, unemployed and unhireable, had been dumped by Victoria the moment her family's wealth evaporated. He was now living in a cheap motel in Queens, drowning in debt. But old money didn't die without throwing a punch. The annual Metropolitan Museum of Art Winter Gala was the jewel of New York society. Clary had purchased a table for $200,000, cementing her arrival in the legitimate elite. She wore a breathtaking custom emerald green gown by Elie Saab, the DeLuca diamonds sparkling at her throat. Gabriel was as always a devastating force of nature at her side, wearing a bespoke velvet tuxedo. They stood on the grand balcony overlooking the Temple of Dender, sipping champagne. Clary had never felt more powerful, more alive. Gabriel's hand rested possessively on the small of her back, a silent warning to any of the billionaire playboys who tried to approach her. "You look beautiful," Gabriel murmured, leaning in close so only she could hear. Half the men in this room are terrified of you, and the other half are in love with you. And what about you? Clary teased, looking up at him through her lashes. I am both, Gabriel replied, his voice deadly serious, sending a shiver of pure heat through her body. Suddenly, the ambient chatter of the gala was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. From the shadows of the Egyptian artifacts, 3 men dressed in catering uniforms drew suppressed MAC-10 submachine guns. They weren't mafia hitmen. Their stances were sloppy desperate. These were mercenaries hired by Arthur DuPont with the last of his black market cash in a final suicidal bid for revenge. "Get down!" Gabriel roared. Before Clary could process the threat, Gabriel tackled her, shielding her body with his massive frame as they crashed behind a heavy stone pillar. The stone shattered above them as a hail of bullets tore through the air. Screams erupted across the museum as New York's elite scattered in sheer panic, trampling each other in their expensive gowns and tuxedos. "Stay here," Gabriel commanded, his eyes turning cold and dead. He drew his weapon from his shoulder holster. "Gabriel, no, there are too many," Clary cried, grabbing his sleeve. He looked back at her, a ferocious, terrifying smile on his face. "I promised I would be your sword, Clary. Let me work." Gabriel rolled out from behind the pillar. The ensuing firefight was brief, brutal, and horrifyingly one-sided. Gabriel moved with the grace of a panther, his shots calculated and ruthlessly precise. 2 precise cracks echoed over the screaming crowd, and 2 of the mercenaries dropped to the marble floor, dead before they realized they had been hit. The 3rd mercenary panicked, spraying wildly into the crowd. He turned and bolted for the service exits. Gabriel didn't run after him. He calmly aimed down his sights and fired a single shot. The mercenary's leg buckled, shattering his femur, sending him crashing through a glass display case in a shower of blood and shards. Silence descended on the massive hall, broken only by the whimpers of the terrified guests hiding under tables. Gabriel holstered his weapon and walked back to Clary, pulling her up from the floor. He checked her frantically for injuries, his hands roaming her arms and face. "Are you hit, Clary? Are you okay?" "I'm fine." She gasped, her heart pounding. She looked past Gabriel to the bleeding mercenary groaning on the floor. Gabriel's earpiece buzzed. His security team had secured the perimeter. He listened for a moment, his jaw tightening. He looked at Clary. "My men just intercepted the getaway driver waiting in the alley," Gabriel said, his voice flat. "It was Bradley Kensington. DuPont promised him a payout to drive the car." Clary froze. Bradley. The man who had mocked her, who had called her a nobody, was so desperate for money he had stooped to being a getaway driver for a hit squad aimed at her. "Bring him to me," Clary ordered, her voice devoid of any warmth. Moments later, 2 of Gabriel's massive enforcers dragged a bruised, weeping Bradley Kensington into the grand hall. He was wearing a cheap-stained tracksuit. When he saw Clary standing there, untouched, radiating absolute power, with Gabriel Rossi standing over the bodies of the hitmen, Bradley collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Clary, please!" Bradley wailed, clutching at the air toward her. "They made me do it. I didn't know they were going to shoot at you. I swear I'm ruined, Clary. I have nothing. Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Clary walked slowly toward him, the emerald silk of her dress dragging across the marble floor. She looked down at the pathetic, groveling man. She remembered the cold rain outside Le Bernardin. She remembered the disdain in his voice when he told her she would drown in his world. She wasn't drowning. She was the ocean. "You were right, Bradley," Clary said softly, her voice echoing in the vast, silent room. "We did run our course. But I'm not the one who is a nobody." She turned to Gabriel. The old Clary would have shown mercy. The old Clary would have let the police handle it. But the Queen of the East Coast knew that mercy in this world was just an invitation for the next bullet. "Take him to the docks," Clary commanded, her voice cold as ice. "I want him to disappear, completely." Bradley screamed, thrashing wildly as the enforcers dragged him away into the darkness, his cries fading into the sirens wailing in the distance. Gabriel stepped up behind her, wrapping his arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He kissed the side of her neck a seal of devotion amidst the chaos. "It's done," Gabriel whispered. Clary looked out over the glittering lights of Manhattan through the museum's glass walls. The city was hers. The nobody had become the nightmare, and she was never going back to the shadows. The morning after the bloodbath at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York City, woke up to a meticulously sanitized narrative. The news anchors on CNN and Fox Business reported a botched robbery by amateur thieves targeting the Egyptian exhibit, neutralized swiftly by private security contractors. Money, Clary was quickly learning, was the ultimate eraser. It wiped away blood-silenced witnesses and rewrote history before the morning coffee was poured. But behind the gilded doors of the ultra-wealthy, the truth was a roaring fire. The elite knew Arthur DuPont had tried to assassinate the new head of the DeLuca syndicate, and they knew he had missed. Clary stood on the helipad of the Hudson Yards Tower, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face. She wore a bespoke camel hair coat over a black turtleneck, looking every bit the untouchable billionaire. Gabriel stood beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the skyline. He wore a dark wool overcoat, his presence a heavy, comforting anchor in the storm they were navigating. "The tactical teams are in position at the Sagaponack estate," Gabriel said over the roar of the approaching Sikorsky helicopter. "Arthur and Victoria have barricaded themselves inside. They've hired private military contractors, ex-Blackwater, heavy artillery." "It doesn't matter how many guns they have," Clary replied, her voice cool and detached. "I own the ground they are standing on. Let's go collect." The flight to the Hamptons took less than 40 minutes. As the helicopter descended toward the sprawling 20-acre oceanfront estate, Clary looked down at the immaculate manicured lawns and the Olympic-sized swimming pool. This was the fortress of old money built on generations of exploitation and arrogance. Today, it was falling. 4 black Chevy Suburbans were already idling on the cobblestone driveway when Clary and Gabriel touched down. A dozen of Gabriel's most lethal enforcers, heavily armed and wearing tactical vests over their suits, flanked them as they marched toward the massive double doors of the mansion. The private military contractors Arthur had hired took one look at Gabriel Rossi, the legendary ruthless ghost of the underworld, and the sheer number of DeLuca hitters, and made a business decision. They lowered their rifles. No paycheck was worth dying in a blood feud against the commission. Gabriel kicked the mahogany front doors open with a deafening crash, splintering the wood. "Arthur." Gabriel's voice boomed through the palatial foyer, echoing off the marble floors and the crystal chandelier. "Your lease is up." From the top of the sweeping grand staircase, Arthur DuPont appeared. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in a single night. His usually immaculate gray hair was disheveled and his hands shook as he gripped the marble railing. Behind him cowered Victoria, clutching a Louis Vuitton overnight bag, her face pale and streaked with mascara. "You animals," Arthur spat, though his voice trembled. "You think you can just march into my home? I have the police commissioner on speed dial. I have senators in my pocket." "Not anymore," Clary said, stepping out from behind Gabriel. She ascended the first 3 steps, her gaze pinning Arthur like a moth to a corkboard. "I bought your senator's debts this morning, and the commissioner declined your call because his pension fund is currently heavily invested in my holding companies. You are entirely alone, Arthur." Victoria sobbed, dropping her bag. "Clary, please. We didn't know about the hit. My father acted alone, I swear. Just let me leave. Let me go to Paris. I have nothing to do with this." Clary looked at the woman who had sneered at her in Le Bernardin, who had called her a charity case. "Paris is expensive, Victoria. Your trust funds are frozen. Your credit cards have been canceled by the banks I now own. The only place you're going is onto the street." Arthur's face twisted in desperate rage. He reached into his smoking jacket, pulling out a small silver revolver. Before he could even raise the barrel, Gabriel's suppressed weapon coughed once. Thwip! Arthur screamed, dropping the gun as blood exploded from his right shoulder. He collapsed onto the stairs, writhing in agony. Victoria shrieked, backing away from her bleeding father in pure terror. Gabriel calmly kept his weapon aimed at Arthur's chest. "You flinch again, DuPont, and the next one goes through your teeth." Search the house, Clary ordered the enforcers. Seize all the hard drives, the physical ledgers, the offshore account keys. Leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. As the men dispersed, tearing the luxurious mansion apart, a sudden piercing siren cut through the ocean breeze. Through the shattered front doors, 3 black unmarked SUVs skidded to a halt on the driveway. Men in tactical windbreakers swarmed out. The bright yellow letters across their backs read, FBI. Leading them was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He walked straight into the foyer, his hand resting on the grip of his service weapon. Federal Bureau of Investigation! The man announced, his voice echoing in the tense room. He flashed a gold shield. Special Agent in Charge Richard Hawthorne. Stand down, Rossi, or my men will turn you into Swiss cheese. Gabriel didn't lower his weapon, his body shielding Clary. The air in the room grew instantly volatile, the DeLuca enforcers raising their assault rifles toward the federal agents. A bloodbath was seconds away. Agent Hawthorne. Arthur gasped from the stairs, clutching his bleeding shoulder. A sickening, desperate smirk crawled onto his pale face. You took your time. Arrest them. Arrest all of them. They broke into my home. Hawthorne looked at Arthur with thinly veiled disgust, then turned his gaze to Clary. Clary DeLuca, you are under arrest for racketeering conspiracy to commit murder and violation of the RICO Act. Clary didn't panic. Her analytical mind, trained by years of archival research and cross-referencing, spun into overdrive. The FBI didn't just show up to a private estate without a warrant, and they certainly didn't answer distress calls for old money billionaires unless there was a pre-existing relationship. Gabriel, lower the gun, Clary commanded softly. Boss, I can take him, Gabriel whispered, a feral growl in his throat. If you shoot a federal agent, we start a war we cannot win legally. Lower it. Reluctantly, Gabriel lowered his weapon. Hawthorne smirked, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Smart girl, Hawthorne sneered, stepping toward Clary. Let's go, sweetheart. The library is closed. As the cold steel locked around her wrists, Clary locked eyes with Gabriel. Don't tear the city apart. Find out who tipped Hawthorne off. Find the mole. The interrogation room at the Federal Plaza was cold, stinking of stale coffee bleach and desperation. Clary sat at the metal table, the handcuffs biting into her wrists. She had been there for 6 hours. No lawyer, no phone call. A psychological breaking tactic. But Clary wasn't a street thug. She was a woman who had spent her life invisible, absorbing information, learning how systems worked. She knew the law better than the agents trying to break her thanks to years of typing Bradley's legal briefs. The heavy metal door clicked open and Agent Hawthorne walked in, dropping a thick file onto the table. Here is the situation, Ms. DeLuca, Hawthorne said, leaning over the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. I have wiretaps. I have offshore bank records showing your sudden acquisition of billions in illicit funds. And I have Arthur DuPont testifying that you ordered an armed assault on his property. You're looking at consecutive life sentences. Clary looked calmly at the file, then up at Hawthorne. Agent Hawthorne, she began, her voice perfectly level. Did you know the average salary for a special agent in charge in New York is roughly $160,000? Hawthorne's jaw tightened. Keep playing games. See how it works out for you. Ahunty, I only ask, Clary continued, because I am curious how a public servant affords a bespoke Patek Philippe Nautilus watch, the one hiding under your left cuff. Retail price is around $80,000, but on the gray market it's closer to $250,000. Hawthorne instinctively pulled his sleeve down. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his eyes. Furthermore, Clary said, leaning forward as much as the cuffs would allow, the FBI did not have time to secure a RICO indictment against me in 3 weeks, which means this is an illegal detention. You are acting off the books. Arthur DuPont pays you. He funneled money into your offshore accounts to protect his shipping lanes, and when I destroyed his empire, I destroyed your retirement fund. Hawthorne slammed his hands on the table, his face turning red. You don't know anything, you little bitch. I know everything, Clary whispered, her eyes turning as cold as the Atlantic. And right now, my people are looking into every digital footprint you have ever left." Before Hawthorne could retaliate, the door swung open again. In walked a high-powered defense attorney in a $5,000 suit, followed closely by the director of the FBI's New York field office. "Agent Hawthorne!" The director barked, his face pale. "Release her immediately. The warrants were entirely fabricated, and her legal team has just filed a multi-million-dollar harassment injunction against this precinct." Hawthorne stared in disbelief as Clary's lawyer unlocked her cuffs. She stood up, rubbing her wrists gracefully. "I'll be seeing you, Richard," Clary said softly as she walked past him. When Clary exited the federal building, Gabriel was waiting by a sleek armored Maybach. He looked like he had been living on pure adrenaline and violence for the last 6 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to snap. The moment he saw her, he abandoned protocol, pulling her into a crushing, desperate embrace right on the street. "I was 20 minutes away from storming the building," Gabriel muttered into her hair, his hands running down her back to assure himself she was whole. "I'm fine," Clary breathed, melting into his warmth. But Hawthorne knew exactly where we were going to be today, and he had access to internal DeLuca syndicate shipping schedules. Arthur DuPont didn't have those. Someone in our family leaked them. Back in the secure penthouse of the Baccarat Hotel, Clary went to work. This was her true domain. Gabriel's soldiers brought her 6 encrypted laptops seized from DuPont's estate. While Gabriel paced the room like a caged tiger, coordinating security sweeps, Clary's fingers flew across the keyboards. She wasn't a hacker, but she was a master archivist. She understood data structures, cross-referencing, and hidden ledgers. She traced the offshore account numbers Arthur had been using to pay Hawthorne. From there, she looked for the source of the funds. The money wasn't coming directly from DuPont. It was being laundered through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Clary cross-referenced the shell company's board of directors with the syndicate's internal payroll. At 3 a.m., the screen flashed with a match. Clary stopped typing. The silence in the room was deafening. Gabriel stopped pacing and walked up behind her chair, looking at the glowing screen. "It's Don Moretti," Clary said, her voice laced with poison. Lorenzo Moretti was the oldest capo in the family. He had sworn allegiance to her after she humiliated Russo, but it had been a lie. Moretti had brokered a secret deal with Arthur DuPont and Agent Hawthorne. If they took Clary and Gabriel out, Moretti would take the throne and split the New York ports with the corrupt FBI agent. Gabriel's eyes went dark, a lethal, terrifying void replacing his irises. He pulled his phone from his pocket. "Where is he?" Gabriel asked softly. "The Brooklyn Navy Yard." Clary read from the GPS tracking logs attached to Moretti's encrypted phone. "Warehouse 4. He's meeting with Hawthorne right now, probably trying to figure out how to salvage their plan." Clary stood up, closing the laptop. She walked over to the glass coffee table, picking up Gabriel's spare weapon, a compact Glock 19. She checked the magazine, a skill Gabriel had taught her during long nights of preparation, and slid it into her designer coat pocket. Gabriel looked at her, his expression a mix of awe and deep protective devotion. "You don't have to come. I will bring you his head." "No," Clary said, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of the boss. "A queen does not hide while her soldiers bleed. We execute the traitors together." The Brooklyn Navy Yard was a graveyard of rusted metal, freezing salt air and shadows. Warehouse 4 sat at the edge of the docks, its massive metal doors rusted shut. Inside, under the flickering glow of a single halogen bulb, Don Lorenzo Moretti paced nervously. Agent Hawthorne stood leaning against a stack of wooden shipping crates, smoking a cigarette, looking violently angry. "You promised me she would rot in a cell," Moretti hissed, his thick Italian accent cutting through the damp air. "She walked out in 6 hours. If she finds out I gave you the shipping log, she will feed me to Gabriel Rossi." "Relax, old man," Hawthorne snapped, flicking his cigarette onto the concrete. "I have a tactical team on standby. We locate Rossi, we put a bullet in his head, and we arrest the girl on federal drug charges. I'll plant the coke myself." "You won't live long enough to plant anything, Richard." The voice echoed from the steel rafters, cold and melodic. Before Hawthorne could draw his weapon, the main circuit breaker blew. The warehouse plunged into pitch darkness. Panic erupted. Moretti's 4 bodyguards unholstered their weapons, shouting in Italian, aiming flashlights wildly into the void. From the shadows, the Reaper arrived. Gabriel moved without making a sound. The first bodyguard was pulled backward into the dark, a sickening crunch echoing as his neck was snapped. The second bodyguard fired wildly toward the noise, the muzzle flash illuminating the crates. Gabriel dropped from the top of a container directly onto the man driving a combat knife through his collarbone. Hawthorne fired his service weapon, screaming in terror. "Show yourself, Rossi!" A suppressed gunshot pinged off the metal beam next to Hawthorne's head. The corrupt agent scrambled behind a forklift, hyperventilating. The backup generators kicked in, bathing the warehouse in a dim, blood-red emergency light. Moretti was backed against the wall, trembling, holding a gold-plated revolver. Gabriel stepped out of the shadows, his face splattered with blood, holding his weapon perfectly steady. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a god of war. "Drop it, Lorenzo!" Gabriel commanded, his voice shaking the floorboards. "I am a Don!" Moretti screamed, tears of fear streaming down his wrinkled face. "I served her grandfather. I will not kneel to a librarian." He raised his gun toward Gabriel. Bang! Moretti gasped, his eyes widening in shock. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his chest. He dropped the gun, his knees buckling as he collapsed onto the concrete floor, dead. Gabriel hadn't fired. He turned around. Clary stood 30 feet away, the Glock 19 raised in both hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Her expression was completely unreadable, an ice queen standing over her ruined kingdom. She slowly lowered the weapon. Hawthorne, seeing his entire plan disintegrate, threw his gun to the floor and raised his hands, stepping out from behind the forklift. Wait! Hawthorne pleaded, his arrogant swagger entirely gone. "Ms. DeLuca, we can make a deal. I have connections in Washington. I can protect your shipping lanes from the feds. I can be an asset." Clary walked slowly toward him, her heels clicking methodically on the concrete, echoing the same terrifying rhythm she had used on Don Russo weeks ago. Gabriel fell into step behind her, an imposing wall of muscle and violence. Clary stopped just inches from the trembling FBI agent. "Q2. You wanted to know how the game is played, Richard," Clary whispered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a flash drive, tossing it at his feet. "On that drive is the undeniable proof of your offshore accounts, your communications with Arthur DuPont, and your illegal wiretaps. By tomorrow morning it will be on the desk of the Attorney General." Hawthorne fell to his knees, sobbing. "Please, I have a family. I'll do anything." "You work for me now," Clary said, her voice dropping to a terrifying register. "Every federal raid, every wiretap, every investigation into the 5 families, you will bring to me first. If you blink without my permission, I will leak that drive. You are no longer an agent of the law. You are my dog." Hawthorne bowed his head, defeated, broken. Yes, Ms. DeLuca. Get out of my sight." As Hawthorne scrambled away into the night, Clary stood in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by the bodies of the traitors. The adrenaline slowly ebbed, leaving a profound, heavy silence in its wake. She had pulled the trigger. She had crossed the final line. There was no going back to the library. There was no going back to the quiet girl in the rain. She felt a warm, strong hand gently take the gun from her grip. Gabriel engaged the safety and tucked it away. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "Are you okay, Mia Regina?" he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. "My queen." Clary leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Gabriel turned her around, his green eyes burning with a possessive, all-consuming fire. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "You conquered the city," Gabriel whispered reverently. "You broke the elite. You purged the traitors. You are the most terrifying, beautiful thing I have ever seen in my life." He crashed his lips onto hers, and this time, the kiss wasn't just adrenaline or fear. It was an absolute surrender. It was the sealing of a dark, beautiful empire. Clary tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, letting the heat of his body chase away the cold of the warehouse. They were two halves of a lethal coin, the mastermind and the executioner, the queen and her king. Weeks later, the dust finally settled on New York City. Arthur DuPont was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for tax evasion and conspiracy. Victoria, stripped of every cent and asset, was last seen working the register at a high-end boutique she used to shop at, forced to serve the very women she used to mock. Bradley Kensington was nothing but a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of the city's dive bars. Clary DeLuca stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, looking down at the glittering expanse of Manhattan. The city was a grid of lights, millions of lives moving unknowingly to the rhythm she now dictated. Gabriel walked up behind her, dressed in a loose black silk shirt, and wrapped his arms around her waist. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "The Russian syndicate is asking for a meeting," Gabriel murmured. "They want to discuss the European shipping routes." Clary smiled, a dark, brilliant expression that belonged to the ruler of the underworld. She turned in his arms, her eyes flashing with power. "Tell them," Clary said. "The Queen will see them now." What a breathtaking finale, from a heartbroken nobody to the absolute ruler of the New York underworld. Clary proved that true power isn't given, it's taken. With the fiercely loyal and dangerously lethal Gabriel Rossi by her side, the DeLuca empire is stronger than ever, and Bradley, Victoria, and the traitors got exactly what they deserved.